Hello, Cardstack community. My name is Chris C. I'm the founding director of the Cardstack Foundation, coming to you from the land of the Web3. Today, we are joined by Michael Kong, the CEO of Fantom Foundation, to talk to us about dApp building on their layer 1 blockchain that use a very unique consensus algorithm and a way to drive both scalability and adoption. So welcome, Michael.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, great to be here, and thanks for the opportunity.
Great. We definitely know that there's a lot of innovation in the blockchain space. Some of them are within the perspective of developers familiar with, and some of them are newer technology. Some of them balances things that may be kind of more creative and something that is more familiar. Can you tell us about your strategy and your idea about where Fantom fits into the kind of overall smart contract space in the blockchain space, and what's unique and what kind of application is uniquely fitted to the solution you can put forth?
Yeah, sure. So Fantom, first of all, is one of these layer 1 blockchains. It's its own standalone distributed ledger. So it consists of our own unique consensus that you briefly mentioned, where we process transactions in an asynchronous manner. In other words, we process multiple transactions at the same time, and on top of that sits a stack that's pretty much very similar to what you have on Ethereum. So it's EVM based at the moment. So the way that you write, compile, and deploy smart contracts on, say, Ethereum works pretty much the same way as on Fantom itself. So any developer out there that's familiar with developing on Ethereum would automatically, by default, be very familiar with deploying on Fantom. You just need to change your network parameters to deploy on the chain, but it pretty much works the same way. The actual benefit really comes down to consensus. Because we can process transactions multiple times simultaneously, it means that the network throughput of the chain is a lot higher than, say, Ethereum, which means that transaction fees get lower. So, for example, like you may perform a swap in Curve that costs you like $50 or even $100, even more than that in some occasions.
Right.
And for Fantom, the equivalent could be like 50 cents or $1. Yeah, exactly. So it will be like 1/100th of the cost. And in addition to that, how long it takes to confirm a transaction is like less than a second. So we produce blocks on average of about 0.8 or 0.9 seconds. And so when your transaction gets automatically included into the block and it gets confirmed by the network, where you need 2/3 plus 1 of the total validating power of the network, then your block or your transaction is final. So you only need 1 block confirmation. You don't need 5 or 6 block confirmations. And that's because it's not dependent on the longest chain rule. So finality is what we call deterministic. It's not probabilistic. It's not based on the longest chain rule. So you get a lot more. You get a lot faster response, a much faster time to finality or transaction confirmations, and you also get far lower transaction fees while having the same environment to be able to deploy smart contracts in.
Yeah. So what's interesting about your consensus algorithm is the parallelism of it and also the finality, right? So parallelism is increasing the throughput, and finality helps with certain use case. For example, like we have a payment system where you can use QR code like WeChat pay each other. On certain chains, it takes like 10 seconds for it to confirm. So are you saying that if we deploy the same thing using the same EVM contract, that we can say, okay, that $5 transfer and it's final in 8.8 seconds? Is that true?
Yeah. On average, it will take like less than a second to confirm a transaction.
I
mean, don't just like take my word for it. I say to any like smart contract developer out there, regardless of what application you're building, because we do support all smart contract based applications, because Fantom is a generalized smart contract platform. I say to all developers out there, just play with the Fantom network, see what your experience is like. And you should see those faster, cheaper transactions. Don't just take my word for it. Go and play with it yourself right now.
Nice, that's great. As far as the community of people developing for EVM, I think there is like 2 groups of people, right? People who say, hey, we're going to learn Solidity, learn the processes on them, learn Etherscan. I know you guys have an Etherscan kind of powered blockchain, so it should be very familiar with people who are using kind of the Ethereum toolset. What do you think would be the unique thing that this type of use case that you've seen within your development community that you're most excited about? Wow, this application wasn't really possible on mainnet, but it works so much better on Fantom that makes you feel excited about the unique proposition. Can you give us some example, maybe one example of something that really seems like a good fit?
Yeah, for example, on the DeFi applications that we have on Phantom. So when you perform a swap on Phantom, using like any of the dexes that we have on Phantom, the two most popular being Spooky Swap and Spirit Swap, which were the original, I'd say the original DeFi applications on Phantom. When you're swapping from one asset to another, it's very, very cheap. It costs you like maybe a few cents at most, and your transaction gets confirmed very, very fast. In fact, it gets confirmed like in about like a second or just under less than a second that the user interface, say on FTM scan, which is the equivalent of Etherscan, but for Phantom, basically has to like can't update fast enough to show you that the transaction's actually gone through. So you might have to wait like a couple more seconds on FTM scan to see it actually like live on and registered on FTM scan, but in reality it's already happened maybe like a couple of seconds earlier than when FTM scan deploys it. And so as you mentioned with Etherscan, it is a familiar like Explorer. We actually have two Explorers. We have our own Explorer and we have FTM Scan. I think most people use FTM Scan. And if you go to the website, it pretty much looks the same as Etherscan, right? So it has like all of the same layouts, the same information. There's a whole bunch of information on gas used over time, number of daily transactions, etc. So again, it's like very familiar user interfaces for Ethereum developers. And we use Web3, we use RPC calls. It's all very familiar developer tools as well.
That's great. When you're talking about like developing for the type of like DeFi application, a lot of organization would deploy to multiple chains, and some of them are like they want to focus on liquidity. What kind of tokens and bridges are available for, especially for DeFi application that has good liquidity, can be a basis for that type of DeFi application right now?
Yeah, so we have a number of bridges that connect Phantom to Ethereum and other Ethereum virtual machine-based chains. So the most popular bridge is called multi-chain .xyz. So multi-chain, we're actually very close to. It's a team that has been around since I think 2018 or 2019, and they've built one of the biggest bridges in the space. I think their total value locked is in the billions of dollars, even though the market is a bit lower now. And I think they've done over like 80 or $85 billion value of transactions. And so the way they work is that they basically act as like a decentralized custodian, right? So they have a whole bunch of validators that basically custody assets on different chains. So for example, if you're moving from Ethereum to Phantom, you just go to the website and you just swap like one token on Ethereum for the equivalent token on Phantom, right? So for example, like Phantom has bridge tokens that are US dollar Circle and USDT. And so you can go to Ethereum, for example, and deposit your USDC on the multi-chain bridge, and you can mint the equivalent one-to-one on Phantom. And so these tokens, say USDC or USDT, work in pretty much the same way as on Phantom. And in fact, it's very easy to bridge any ERC20 token from Ethereum to Phantom and back and forth because of how the technology works. So, from time to time, we get requests from projects in the community that are deploying a Phantom that they want to bridge tokens from Ethereum. It might be, for example, their own native token that they want to bridge. And we put them in contact with the multi-chain team, and they very quickly, are able to, reading the contract address and reading a few other details around the token address, the token contract, and basically deploy it and custody it like very, very fast. I think almost instantly, actually. So that's the most well-known bridge. But we've got other bridges as well. For example, we've got like Wormhole, we've got like Ren BTC, we've got a few other bridges as well. So they're a bit smaller on the Phantom network just because they haven't integrated as much, but they still do millions of dollars in volumes probably on the daily basis. And there are more bridges coming over to Phantom as well.
What are you seeing in the bridge space? I mean, there are a lot of organizations that's like thinking about new way of generalizing the bridges between the chain instead of just making point to point with Ethereum in the center, but kind of like a more point-to-point model. Chainlink is working on something like CCIP, which is like a standard to do something like that. You see Layer 0 trying to figure out a way to kind of generalize that, as well as Nomad doing something really interesting around bridges and the coordination for state channel for these kind of cross-chain application. what is your view on like this idea that multiple chains interact more closely than they currently do? Do you see that we will see more like city clustered and then spaced apart, and then there's like roads between them, or do you see growing closeness because of the bridge innovation? What's your view?
I think there's going to be like multiple bridges coming into existence, and I think those sorts of like technologies such as Layer Zero or Polkadot that are trying to like connect multiple chains together, could really work in the end. They're kind of experimental technologies. They haven't integrated with like many chains out there yet.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got to see like how they work. But they could be like very powerful alternatives to the current bridges that we have right now. Because one of the big risks with the current bridges is that they're single points of failure, right? So, for example, if like
Right.
multi-chain or RenBTC or Wormhole was somewhat compromised, there's a lot of money that exists in those bridges, and so if those bridges are not secure, then a lot of funds on either chain, whether it's like Ethereum or Fantom or other chains, could be like permanently lost, right? And in fact,
Mm-hmm.
we saw that even though multi-chain was audited and they run a great team, it's very hard to keep your technology extremely secure across every single line of code. And in January of this year, actually, it turns out that there were vulnerabilities in 6 token contracts that did lead to the
Mm.
loss of a few $1 million worth of funds. But fortunately, they had a really great security auditor helping them out to preserve most of the capital in those 6 token contracts, but they still had a bit of an
Right.
exploit, which wasn't very good. Um,
Yeah.
but again, like there are security considerations with um, those alternative like technologies, like connecting the different layer ones together, and
Mm-hmm.
it's experimental as I mentioned before. So we've got to see how it really plays out in the end. And also, like security is getting better and better over time. Like multi-chain has new features like coming out all the time. For example, like more recently, a few months ago, they had like a better routing system come out that they call Router, and other bridges and the technologies will be will be improving over time as well. So there's a lot of innovation happening in the
Mm-hmm.
space, and we'll just see what the market decides.
Yeah, and I think the options that's given to people who want instant kind of transfer are leaning towards the state channel approach, right? What Connects Network is doing, that's pretty cool. Is if you have liquid
Mm,
player like stable coins, and it's fairly easy to get some counterfactual type of stuff going on where you can just have it instantly show up the other side. And then if you want to have your own token and then you want to secure and feel like you're getting at that from that kind of multi chain smart contract, you could do that. Do you have
yeah,
preference on either one of those approaches?
yeah. I mean, um, we're starting to see a lot of innovation when it comes to like cross-chain swaps, right? So there are dexes out there
Mm-hmm.
that now make it easy using bridge technology to easily swap one asset to a completely different asset on another chain
Yeah,
at a
on another
particular
chain. Yeah.
exchange rate.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's quite difficult to do actually. And that is quite useful though,
Mm.
because if you do it correctly, you're basically removing one step, right? So, say you want to go from
Yes.
Ethereum to Phantom, but you want to swap, say, like USDC to native Phantom token, right? Well,
Yeah.
if you were to like not use this cross-chain swap, you would first have to like swap it to Phantom and then bridge to Phantom, or swap the USDC to USDC on Phantom and then swap it to Phantom. So the fact that you can do these cross-chain swaps now, which are relatively new, I think they're only maybe about a couple months old, is quite
Yeah.
useful. And so if people can do that well, then I think that's going to get more and more traction. But I think right now the bridge technology does work pretty well. The user interfaces are very straightforward to use. The bridging happens usually quite fast. Of course, it depends on how long it takes for settlements to occur on either chain, but usually they work pretty well. But yeah, I'm very curious to see more powerful functionality coming out with regards to cross-chain swaps.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this, for the security model for swap, especially out of Ethereum, because of that consensus algorithm of having the longest chain, you have to wait some confirmation before the other side get minted, right? You want to
That's
make sure you
right.
don't have a chain or not. So obviously going the other way would be much easier because you guys have instant finality. Does that
Well,
affect things?
well, when you're swapping between two chains, the speed at which the bridging happens is really dependent on the slowest chain, or how long it,
So chain, right.
or like how long it takes, or like the longest length of time it takes to get it confirmed to one chain, right? Because if you're swapping, for example, from Ethereum to Fantom, right, you still need to have
That's
your
true.
transactions settled on Ethereum before you get it settled on
Right.
Fantom. Yeah, so
Right.
it really
Yeah.
depends on both. Yeah.
So whoever finished first doesn't get to go and celebrate. You have to wait for the other party to continue.
Yeah, that's exactly
So
right.
that makes sense, right? Because both sides have to say I'm good, and then the other side say I'm good, and then it's good for sure.
Yeah.
Do you see obviously you have a novel leaderless consensus mechanism that gives you that benefit. Do you think developers are like still really interested in the types of consensus? I think in the early days of Cambrian explosion of blockchain ideas from more UTXO stuff to EVM stuff into the new stuff. Do you find yourself needing to explain your consensus algorithm as part of your value proposition, or is it really about the user experience?
Well, the consensus mechanism really is about the user experience, because, as I like to tell people, all the technology work that we're doing, whether it's to do with the consensus improvement, transaction processing improvement, or improvements to the way that you execute smart contracts by working on middleware related problems, is all about user experience in the end. That's why we're doing all this technology, right? Because in the end, we want to grow and develop the Fantom ecosystem. We want it to be as big as possible, with as many different kinds of applications as possible. And so in the end, having better technology means better user experience. And what do I mean by user experience? I mean, users care about, in my opinion, fundamentally three things: how fast, how cheap, and how secure with regards to transactions. So if you can optimize for those three, then that's ideal. So that's why when I explain to people about Fantom technology, what makes Fantom different, I really can go into a lot of depth about how the asynchronous processing of transactions work, because it is important to know this in order to really understand fundamentally how you get those how you get the faster transactions, how you get those low cost transactions, as I mentioned before, using Curve as an example, and how it is still secure, even though you're able to increase the network throughput. So to me, it is very important to explain the technology, because that shows you fundamentally how it really works and why what I'm saying is true, and why when you interact with the network, it really works as it appears to work.
So I think there are some people who tell me that the wallet experience as it relates to dApp on the desktop and the MetaMask, which is really compatible and people use it and they connect to hardware wallet, has been the primary way that especially people working on DeFi interacts, because it's an expected interface. They know how to ensure security and stuff like that. But for mass market adoption, as people care about, hey, I just want to have my app work, people are leaning towards mobile as the experience to engage. You see new NFT application. Again, app stores are somewhat sluggish to approve certain things. What's your view on the importance of mobile for the growth of the Fantom ecosystem?
I think it's very important. I think it's important for the growth of the crypto ecosystem overall, right? Because most people in the world have mobile phones that can access the internet. They don't necessarily have as many like laptop computers, right? And that's particularly the case in developing countries. Like in developing countries, it is actually like inexpensive to acquire like a relatively decent Android phone, is my understanding, right? But it's multiple
Right.
times more expensive to be able to buy and operate like a basic laptop. So having a mobile experience
Right.
is really how you get much bigger exposure to the market as a whole, right? And so, these mobile wallets, such as like Trust Wallet, Coinbase Wallet, Slope Wallet, and like many other wallets out there, wallet providers out there, to serve a really, really important part of the market. Yeah. So what's really important is being able to, be able to interact with dApps and NFTs and other applications on the network via mobile, as well as like also via desktop. Obviously, I mean, I think right now there is quite a lot of desktop penetration. Obviously, tools like MetaMask have been very helpful in doing that. But we
Yeah.
also need to be more mobile friendly. But I think people are building applications that are more mobile friendly in the end. So I think we're getting there anyway.
Yeah, we totally agree. We've been developing a smart contract wallet that uses Gnosis Safe on Gnosis Chain. So that's where we're doing a lot of experimentation of the Gnosis Safe infrastructure because it's really well deployed there and is well managed. There's a lot of interesting extension from the Zodiac project doing that, and we've been focusing on that one. And we have a React Native based application running on iOS on the App Store and on Android. And every single time we realize we can borrow a lot of ideas from application that people are using every day in Play Store and say, oh, what if we make this onboarding process, the crypto onboarding process? So I think there's a lot of opportunity to go beyond the stock trading application kind of looking and try to think about like how to engage through the mobile form factor and the type of let's call it genres of software, social networking, news feeds, like badges or game awards or achievement type of UI. And we started to explore those things and play around with them in a cross-platform way to see what ways to show people the capability of these EVM contracts. They don't all need to look like a token list with plus and minuses or grid of NFTs. That there are different ways of presenting the same information. So I completely agree. Still very experimental, right? Because right now people are still used to not be able to see the NFTs in most wallets, and some only recently added those support. But we definitely believe in that very much.
Yeah, I totally agree in what you're saying there. I mean, user interfaces are just going to get better over time. It's just a natural evolution that, it's no surprise that the technology, began first of all, with the command line interface, and then began with like a few basic websites and managing your own wallets like on the desktop. Evolved to plugins like MetaMask and Chrome, now to like mobile wallets. I think that's just a natural evolution of technology, and we've seen that in
Yeah.
cryptos. And so I think it's just going to continue. And I think the user interfaces are going to become more and more familiar to the average user, just like internet browsers became more familiar to the average user back in the 1990s. And it's just going to keep developing and getting better and more sophisticated.
Yeah, absolutely. And then what's really interesting about, we use a Wallet Connect as the primary way because that's kind of, the way to associate a dApp. We actually have a command line program that we use to do certain operation for maintenance and stuff like that. And our developer one day decided, you know what, instead of putting these keys in the mobile app, let's just use the little boxes to draw a QR code in our command line and we scan it using a wallet and we approve that way. And it worked. So the cool thing about mobile wallet is that actually helps the command line experience for developer because you can draw on the command line a QR code with boxes, right? That I couldn't believe that when it worked. But this idea of this phone and the scanners and the ability to maybe in the future tap on NFC support really, I think, close the gap between the expectation of an application that is backed by blockchain versus one that isn't. I think with blockchain like yours, where you don't have to wait and spend $50 and wait 2 minutes for something to do it, it may just blend together and you can't even tell.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the direction that we're going. I think there's big value in making the user experience easier and faster, particularly for the average user over time. And that will help gain adoption as naturally like more and more people discover blockchain technologies and discover what you can do with them. It's just going to keep growing, I think.
Yeah. What is your thoughts about the Web5 announcement? So Jack Dorsey had a Web5 announcement, said, hey, we're going to anchor everything on Bitcoin and there's going to be no tokens. There's a new Web3 features. I'm familiar with the underlying pinning because came from the Decentralized Identity Foundation with the work they've done on ION and the side tree approach. Do you see there to be another evolution that moves away from the Web3 technology or take ideas of it? Do you think the Web3 ecosystem without composability in our smart contract and more importantly, the community skill set can withstand the onslaught of these alternate approaches, which are valid and useful and very interesting. And I explore it. We are part of the Decentralized Identity Foundation and we know about those work as it was going on. What's your thoughts on Web5 versus Web3?
To be honest, I'm a little confused about what Jack is intending to do because in the past, Jack has like criticized, for example, like Web3 as being like controlled by VCs and saying that smart contracts are not very good because they're very insecure and a lot of smart contracts have been hacked and like a lot of money has been stolen. And on both counts, there are valid arguments that he's making there. They're not necessarily like completely wrong, but then he's decided to launch what he calls Web3, right? Which is basically like smart contract or or application-based functionality on the Bitcoin network. And that's something that Bitcoin maxis or maximalists don't really like, because they see Bitcoin or they see cryptocurrencies as being fundamentally useful for two things, and that is like as a store of value and a means of payment. In other words, like as basically a form of money and nothing else in that. And Jack Dorsey used to emphasize or support like Bitcoin maximalist ideas such as that, and that was his criticism of, say, Ethereum and other chains. But now he seems to have come around full circle, but now wants to deploy this sort of functionality on Bitcoin itself, which to me, in terms of adoption, I'm not really sure about, because people who use smart contracts, use like Ethereum and use like the so-called like alternative layer one, such as Fantom. I don't think many people who are big fans of smart contracts or like interacting with smart contracts would necessarily want to be using Bitcoin. I think people see Bitcoin as fundamentally as a form of money, and the chain being used to like exchange that form of money, and nothing really more than that. And that's one of the fundamental principles of actually many people in the Bitcoin network, actually. So I'm a little bit confused as to like where he exactly wants to go with Web5, and I'm really interested to see where he ends up taking it, and his whole philosophy behind it as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of really strong people on that team thinking about various type of documents you can exchange. And Munib from Blockstack had a pretty good tweet, which is that Web5 is a strict subset of Web3. You can do almost all the anchoring and the roll-ups that you could do on top of these Bitcoin anchor thing using a smart contracts platform. So it's going to be interesting to see the composability that comes from this particularly unique model of fitting within the technical limitation of Bitcoin versus one that embraces the flexibility and, more importantly, the shared skills of the developer to be creative about what they can do with Solidity for these kind of anchoring use cases. He's basically proposing a layer 2 Bitcoin rollup, right? Like, that's essentially kind of what it is.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And there are a lot of smart contract developers out there these days, and obviously like the language that I'm most familiar with is like Solidity, and to a lesser extent Viper. And these are what are known as Turing complete languages, right? So these are languages which allow you to program whatever arbitrary functionality you want in there. And that's been one of the big criticisms of Bitcoin users, in that if you can program arbitrary functionality in there, it means that it's the potential for there to be vulnerabilities, significantly increases compared to, say, like a non-Turing complete language. And it is true that on average, non-Turing complete languages are more secure than Turing complete languages, right? Because they restrict the amount of functionality you can do. But if you want to be able to perform all that like sort of functionality, you will need to use like sort of a like a Turing complete language, right? Like the sort of functionality that you see on Ethereum and other chains. And also, a lot of people, will not be familiar with developing on Web5. If they choose to use a different programming language or non-Turing complete language, a lot of people who are into application building, who are familiar with building smart contracts, would have to like completely relearn how to write smart contracts and deploy smart contracts on top of the Bitcoin network. So there is like a lot of friction there in terms of actually getting developer adoption.
Yeah, and it was really interesting when Ethereum first came out with the EVM, and people say, "Oh, I have to write assembly." And then obviously there's two languages you mentioned, but both of them, Serpent on one side, I think, and then is it Serpent or something else?
I think it's Viper now. I think it used to be
Viper. Yeah, it used to be Viper. Like I haven't done the Python series. I think everybody went with Solidity basically, right? And what's interesting about it is that the Solidity. Well, it's it's expressed the same underlying anything, and I you certainly have that preference and be able to use the one that allows you to be more able, but it's still composable, which is a great thing about it. What's interesting about it is that JavaScript or Python are something that people are familiar with, the programming model and stuff like that. And when we introduce we're going to use something more like a functional language, you could do that, and there are smart contract platform that embraces the functional composition language, whether it's based on OCaml or based on Lisp, but these kind of programming languages. But I can tell you the most developer that works commercially or wants to have a career really don't learn that anymore. So there's definitely a friction between the benefits that comes with it and the fact that there's a self-selection of people, not just because they want to learn Web3, but they're just not functional programmers. Do you see that as a deficiency for those other languages that may be more composable but less popular?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, most people who are like developers or software engineers, they're much more familiar with object-oriented programming,
Object oriented, yep.
OOP, such as Java, Python, C,
Yes.
Solidity, Viper, etc., than they are of functional programming. I mean, obviously there are like a decent number of functional programmers out there, but they're definitely like smaller, in terms of developers than there are of object-oriented programmers. And in addition to that, most people prefer to develop in object-oriented programming rather than using a functional language, just because they see it as kind of a bit more intuitive, right? Because it's kind of more centered around, like how like our language is structured, right?
Yeah.
And also like languages like OCaml and Lisp and others, like arguably you may argue that they are better in terms of like writing smart contracts because they are it's easier to verify the code
Yeah.
that you've
Yeah.
written with those sorts of languages because of their structure. However, not many people know how to program in OCaml, and it's difficult, right? Not many people know how to, or more people know how to program in Lisp, but not that many people know how to program in Lisp. And so even though you have security properties which are going to be more certain in, say, OCaml, if people are not able to write OCaml smart contracts that well anyway, it kind
Securely.
of defeats the purpose. And
Right.
even there are, there's
Yeah,
not going to be
that's
many
true.
people who are going to be willing to put in that sort of effort to learn how OCaml works, because if a lot of people are already familiar with like JavaScript, and as you mentioned, like
Yes.
Solidity is like a JavaScript-like language. In fact, that's how they advertise it as, which has its pluses
Yes.
and definitely has a lot of minuses as well. But the fact of the matter
For
is that
sure.
it's easy for people to understand and more intuitive. And so I'm not exactly sure what sort of programming language or languages Jack has in mind for Web5. But there are trade-offs, right? I mean, you could have like a JavaScript-like language, but then you open yourself potentially to more vulnerabilities. You have like an OCaml-based language, which arguably is more secure, but restricts the number of people who can develop those sorts of applications, and so you might not get that much network effects in the end. So there's always trade-offs when it comes to languages, as there are generally with like most things in life, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of when I was looking at the work of that prior to it called Web5 at the Decentralized Identity Foundation, the idea of personal data store is really about storing like documents of certain types. So it's really a document database that's anchored on Bitcoin as a roll up. And you still rely on kind of reasoning of like, how is my contact record and this ownership record and this certificate I got issued relate? And that's really where you need that imperative programming language. At Cardstack, we do Solidity development around the smart contract for payments and for granting people access to certain things. But our big investments in JavaScript, so like, making the front end more composable using JavaScript actually benefits from the fact that there's some functional programming components in JavaScript that you can combine with the easier to understand object orientation. So I think what's really interesting about JavaScript is that never counted out, right? It's like a cockroach language. You can never kill it, right? It was designed, it's a language created in 10 days, but it has last all this time since the Mosaic browser or even before that. So my personal feeling is I'm bullish on languages that kind of catch on to a zeitgeist. People will keep learning it, and Solidity is one of them. JavaScript is one of them. Python and Viper is definitely one of them.
Yeah.
What is your favorite? Like, if you were to kind of pick a language to do a project, what would you pick?
Well, just to comment on Solidity, like just to be
Yeah.
very clear to the audience, I believe fundamentally Solidity is not a good language, right? Because there are many pitfalls with Solidity. I mean, any smart contract developer listening knows what I'm talking about, right? Like, for example, integer overflows, being able to like have infinite loops be created very easily. These are sort of properties that you really don't want in a language, but properties that exist on Solidity that you always have to take into account, and you always have to use like different libraries in order to avoid these sorts of issues. For example, like
Right.
SafeMap library from OpenZeppelin, right?
Yeah.
And so I think when it comes to like security of Solidity contracts, and this is something that we've focused on Fantom because it's very important for us. One, with a new virtual machine, if you can do symbolic execution or check for errors in programming languages at the virtual machine, it doesn't matter what language you use to compile to that virtual machine. You always have those checks that can be done at the virtual machine level, which gives you like the highest degree of certainty if you do those checks correctly. And also, there's other software, for example, being deployed on Fantom that automatically does symbolic execution
Interesting.
more continuously on existing contracts and existing bytecode that exists on the network. So that's where the security guarantees can really come into place, unless you fundamentally change the programming language and how it operates. But I think a lot of people know how to use Solidity and are really entrenched with it. So I don't think Solidity is going to have a drastic change anytime soon, in my opinion. And there's no proposals for it. Although people might start using alternative programming languages like Viper. In terms of like my favorite programming languages, I mean, there's like a bunch, but like, you mentioned one like Python. Like what I really like about Python is that it's like quite a generalized language. So it's very easy to write. The syntax is very easy to learn. You can use the functionality for data analysis. You can use all sorts of like different libraries to kind of speed up how the analysis works. You can use it for like web development. You can use it for like all sorts of tools. Now, it's not the fastest language out there, which is why, like, for example, like our chain is not written in Python, it's written in Golang, but it is like quite a nice like programming language. I mean, like other programming languages that are quite nice. JavaScript isn't too bad. JavaScript doesn't have the same kind of security properties or security issues that say Solidity does. For example, it's like harder to get to have like overflows. Golang is of course like a very nice language, as well as like a language like with a C, like a more like fundamental language. So those are languages that I like. I quite like. I haven't programmed in a while, to be honest, just because I've been like doing more management. But yeah, those are kind of like programming languages come to mind. Definitely not Solidity.
Solidity is kind of like what you accept as the language you need to speak just to be part of something, but it is the one that people step into, which I think is really great. The more and more you see developers' first language is Solidity, especially ones that's drawn. We recently did a project with NYU at a master's program, and there's a lot of interest in doing Web3 project. And even though it was out of scope to make your own smart contract, they want to make your own smart contract. It was an NFT. NFT carbon credit compensation system. So it's analysis in Python and then it's compensation on chain. But they really want to learn it. So you have a lot of people who find Solidity accessibility and the ability to belong to this community to be very valuable, and they instantly become someone who can learn about Fantom and contribute thereafter. So it serves that purpose very well, whether we like it or not.
Yeah, I mean, like what I'd say about people who want to learn how to program like smart contracts and they're just learning programming for the first time, is not really to start with Solidity because Solidity has like a bunch of like specific issues related to the way you code smart contracts because of the nature of, let's say, smart contracts and distributed computing, right? So for example, like usually in programming languages, you won't have like a kind of like re-entrancy exploit, right? Where you can keep calling the same function again and again and again to like withdraw, say, from the ATM before the ATM like realizes that updates your balance, right? And this was kind of like this was kind of like an exploit that, for example, like we found out about in 2016 when someone managed to compromise what was known as the DAO, which was like basically the first DAO that came into existence on Ethereum. They had like millions of like the DAO, literally the DAO. that was what it's called. It had like millions of dollars worth of ETH back then when ETH price was a lot lower. So I suggest to people that they do, for example, like an online course or an in-person course, an introduction to programming, and these courses on a variety of different what are called like MOOCs, massive like online courses, are all free. They're very, very good. I've done them before. I've looked through them, and they really teach you the fundamentals of programming. How like if statements work, how for loops work, how all of these like different properties that are common across many different languages out there, how they kind of like perform, right? And these are the sorts of like characteristics that you see in Solidity and you see in many different like languages out there as well. And usually they begin with like Python, which is nice because then you don't have to worry too much about the syntax. You just worry about more the fundamentals of like how you actually like program something, right? And then when you learn about Solidity, learning how to write Solidity is not very difficult, particularly you already have a programming background. The syntax is not very difficult. It's JavaScript-like, as I mentioned before. But the hardest thing about writing a smart contract is the security, because there are many like
Hmm.
pitfalls, and there's sometimes subtle pitfalls that you can fall into that have devastating consequences for your smart contract. For example, there can be like a simple bug in your smart contract that causes like an integer overflow, which means that someone's able to steal literally every single dollar that's in the smart contract.
Right.
So for any smart
All
contracts
it
out there,
takes.
you really yeah, for any smart contract developer out there, you really need to understand, every single security exploit that has ever happened on a smart contract, and how you avoid those, and what sort of libraries you need to use. For
Hmm.
example, like OpenZeppelin, in order to make sure that you avoid those sorts of like bugs, and really, really look over your code carefully, and try and write the most minimal code possible. Because when you deploy a smart contract on the network, usually it's there forever. And if your code is inefficient, then it will consume too much gas, and it'll
Right.
cost too much to use, when you could have like done the same functionality but done it a lot more efficiently, and therefore have users pay a lot less fees. And so, writing efficient smart contracts and writing secure smart contracts is very, very difficult. That's why,
Hmm.
even though Solidity looks deceptively easy, to write something that's of high quality is actually very, very hard.
Right. Yeah, we have developers been working on Solidity since 2017, which is a long time. And every year we learn something. And it's a collective
Yeah.
experience that's shared, and the auditors, and they're the people who are spreading the news of what you can and cannot do, and what you should do, what tools you must and must not use. So I think it's a communal practice. We're trying to just get a little bit ahead of the hackers and the bad guys, and try to provide something that's secure and useful, and more importantly, efficient, because inefficiency costs real money, especially on chains where each bunch of gas actually costs some real USD. But even on chains that are lower cost, you never know the demands and everything. You want to make sure that it's most efficient possible. Completely agree. Awesome. One note about the data analytics stuff. I think what's really interesting about using Python as the first language is that it does introduce people to the important data. And blockchain is about data. It's about data availability. It's about data publicity, or like sharing. And to be able to use that data in Python to shape on-chain behavior, like the airdrops, like for OP or something like that. They analyze a bunch of data about people doing in protocol, has nothing to do with optimism, just to find a way to get it. So data analytics and blockchain is a pretty interesting thing, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there are a lot of like data analytics providers out there, that analyze chain data, and they're able to do it with a lot of detail, because obviously, with a network such as Phantom and other chains such as Ethereum, all that information is a public blockchain, right? So
Yes.
anybody with a
Yeah.
computer can connect to the network, can connect to a node in the network, and basically read all of the data that exists on the chain. And so, we've seen a lot of providers out there, that analyze chain data, and create reports for people that they can study, and, for example, like trade on. You also have like firms that analyze data for more cybersecurity, AML, KYC purposes,
Yes.
and kind of do
Yes.
like risk assessments on wallets. So I think the fact that the chain is public adds a lot of like useful features to the blockchain, right? Like, obviously it has some disadvantages. Most notably, if you ever want to keep some sort of data private, or private transactions, that's very hard to do. But
Hmm.
if you're operating on an open network, a lot of people criticize blockchains as, oh, people use Bitcoin for money laundering, and people use cryptos for money laundering, and to some extent, that is true, but they use it to a very minimal extent compared to, say, the US dollar. I mean, the currency that most people use, or the thing that most people use to launder money, is the
Hmm.
US dollar, right? The
Hmm.
reason why blockchains are actually not good for money laundering, right? And actually have good security properties that are anti-money laundering, is the fact that you can trace all of the data on chain, right? It's hard to trace every US dollar in existence, right? It's hard to trace physical paper currency in
Oh, for
existence,
sure.
right?
Yeah.
But it is a lot easier to track, balances that change across the network, across wallets in the network, quite easily, because all the data is there. You just have to read it yourself. And so, and
Hmm.
it doesn't require you, to physically access, vaults, or like specific areas, or specific countries. All you have to do is just like have a computer and connect it to the internet, right? Or connected to the chain. So in
Yeah.
actual fact, like, the fact that the chain is public is it helps secure the chain against it being used for like money laundering because
Yeah.
it exposes that public information. And so
And it's
I
forever.
think
It's
data
forever,
analytics
right?
is
Like the analytics
that's
will get
that's
smarter
right,
over
it's
time, and then
forever.
can people?
That's exactly right. So one of the properties of the ledger, is that it's consistent across all nodes and it exists forever. You're not supposed
Yeah.
to be able to rewrite, the ledger going back to like, a week or year or month or anything like that. That property is known as like immutability, right? And
Mm-hmm.
the fact that you have immutability, the fact that you have a consistent, essentially an accounting-based ledger across any n number of computers means that, it's very easy to trace if there is criminal behavior going on without even having to know the particular identities behind certain wallets. So
Yeah.
that's a very,
Just the
I
patterns
think,
itself. Yeah.
useful
Mm-hmm.
feature. Yeah, I think that's a very useful feature. So, where some people might criticize, blockchains for enabling money laundering, I think it actually does the opposite. I think it helps prevent money
Mm-hmm.
laundering being used, or it helps prevent the chain being used by money laundering. And I think you can
Yeah.
see that in the statistics. There's probably like 500, 1,000 times more dollars worth of money laundering done, on the US dollars, using US dollars than there is on blockchains itself.
Yeah, and if you think about the security budget for AML compliance in the U.S. dollar denominated international network, if you look at how many jobs, how many office building, how much air conditioning it is, and look at the carbon footprint of that security budget for AML and doing it
Exactly.
badly, let's to say, I think it's unfair to look at, the blockchain things and say, hey, we're giving this particular traceability. But, I think people do not like take the holistic view approach. It's like, how much money do we waste ineffectively try to do AML in the US dollar denominated financial system? So much paperwork that goes in, and they really catch very, 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 very small percentage of it.
Oh yeah, I mean, like obviously the vast majority of people who use like the financial system, who use the banking system, have done absolutely nothing wrong, right? Yet,
Yes, for sure.
as I'm sure like all of your listeners and ourselves have experienced, we've had to do tremendous amounts of paperwork to sign up with
Yes.
banks, right? We had to tell them every detail about yourself, multiple forms of IDs, home addresses, basically like so much about your life, right? And all of that, costs a lot of time, costs a lot of money. Compliance costs for banks are going up and up and up, which means that only
Yeah.
bigger banks or the more profitable banks can continue to exist. So there's reduced competition in the
Mm-hmm.
banking sector as a result of it. And you're right. Like we've seen time and time again, banks and financial institutions being fined for literally laundering billions of dollars. So even though with all of these AML KYC systems in
Mm-hmm.
place, and even though they're becoming more and more strict over time, you still see instances time and time again of banks, getting in trouble for laundering money for criminals. I mean, we've seen that across banks all over the world. In US banks, we've had instances in Australian banks, and so the system clearly, has some gaps in there that where the AML KYC regimes like simply don't really prevent the actual criminals from being able to launder money for the banks
Mm-hmm.
themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And you see the fines being levied like 10 years later to a bank. It's a slap on the wrist, and there's really not enough deterrence no matter what happened. It was interesting you
Yeah,
mentioned
yeah,
KYC. One
yeah,
kind
yeah,
of.
yeah, yeah. And of course they do.
Go ahead.
So I was going to mention, yeah, and of course, like for the governments, like they see it as like a money making opportunity, right? Oh, you did something wrong, but hey, just give more money, just pay this tax to the government essentially, or pay this fine to the government, and
Yeah.
you can go on your merry way. And if you do it again, it's the cost of doing business. We'll just tax you again, so we'll just get more revenue for them, right? So the governments don't, in my opinion, don't really care about the issue. They say they care about the issue
Mm-hmm.
and they make a lot of noise about it.
Mm-hmm.
But if they really cared about the issue, then certain individuals that would allow this money laundering to take place would be prosecuted,
Yeah.
right? But nobody ever gets prosecuted in the banks, as far as I'm aware. It's really the bank itself that gets prosecuted, but no individual suffers particular consequences as a whole. And the bank just pays a fine, just carries on its business, and then it
Mm-hmm.
probably happens again, and they get caught, they just pay a fine, and that's kind of like the world that we live in.
Yeah, it's really like you were able to make $1,000, and then it's like, hey, there's a fine. You have to pay me $2. I mean, it is essentially that scale. But the problem is that there's $200 million, and most people reading the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, or local papers like, well, that's a lot of money. I can tell you, the bank doesn't think $200 million is a lot of money.
Yeah, exactly. It's just a cut of the profits, right?
Yes.
It's just the cost of doing
Yes.
business. That's how they see it.
Absolutely. I want to wrap up on talking about like the mass market adoptions and getting more people involved. Someone told me that know your customer KYC is like a financial thing. Find your customer is something that's uniquely interesting when the customer transaction history is on chain and you can target them through airdrops and promotions and other type of wallet NFT activity. What is your sense of like how do we get more people, especially a lot of exchanges were leading this last past bear market talking about some version of you gotta not be late to this game, but one of the more organic and more productive and probably more sustainable way is actually get people to shift their commerce to Web3, to actually buy instead from each other, instead of using Uber, using whatever it might be. What do you think is the kind of like consumer adoption commercial utility model that you're seeing, or what do you think Fantom's role is in bringing the next batch of user who's going to come to Web3 to actually play on the Web3 and not just looking at it as a crypto casino?
Yeah, so I think, compared to say 2017 and 2018, we do have like now real use cases on chain, although they are no means like perfect. So, the two most popular use cases of blockchain technologies right now are DeFi or decentralized
Mm-hmm.
finance and NFT related activities, right?
Right.
Where it's to do with like gaming or metaverses, it's just like non-fungible, unique data. And
Yeah.
I think both have like, really powerful use cases, and I don't think they're going to go away anytime soon. It'll be interesting to see what kind of like regulations take place, and particularly with regards to DeFi. But I think
Yeah, for sure.
these are fundamental use cases that I think are just going to keep evolving over time, as opposed to say 2017, 2018, when it was mostly just ICOs, just fundraising, and nothing more
Mm-hmm.
behind it. But I think there are going to be more and more use cases used. I've seen more governments and institutions, look at into like supply chain management.
Right.
We did a bit of that work at Fantom itself. Verifying the importation of generic drugs from India into Afghanistan with the previous Afghanistan administration. Obviously, that program had to stop, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
But we managed to certify, tens of thousands of products because they have a big issue around counterfeit medicine,
Right.
even for generic products in Afghanistan itself. And so I think you're going to have more, data saved on chain, whether it's, unique data around like products, supply chain management, around land registry. And I also think you're going to see other use cases you haven't really seen so far, such as P2P insurance. I think there's a big
Mm.
opportunity to essentially convert like an insurance company into a DAO and have people
Mm-hmm.
kind of like pull their resources together and basically take advantage of the benefits of P2P insurance, which is avoiding the moral hazard where people are not incentivized anymore to keep claiming excessively more than they have to claim, because now you're claiming through people that you know personally in your pool and you're completely
Mm-hmm.
transparent with them. The fact that you don't have the big overhead with third party costs, like a big bureaucracy, which is another one of the benefits of like DeFi, for example, and the fact that because you're held accountable to each other, everybody generally like has to behave a bit better to one another, because now it's not you like taking advantage of the big bad insurance company, it's you taking advantage of your friends, right?
Yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
people are less inclined to kind of do that because they also have there's a social cost to it, there's a reputational cost to it, and I think that reputational cost of insurance doesn't really get reflected in the current insurance model. So I think that's a very, very powerful use case that we will see
Mm-hmm.
over the next few years. I honestly believe it's $1 billion opportunity. It's an opportunity that I looked into before I started Fantom, I think in early
Mm-hmm.
2017, but I never really took it anywhere. But I know there's a few people working in P2P insurance, and this is to do with like more traditional insurance products like automotive insurance,
Right.
home and contents insurance, whole life insurance policy, rather than insurance of DeFi products. So I'm not really talking about
Right. Right. Right.
insurance of DeFi products or smart contracts, but more like traditional based insurance. So I think that's another like really powerful use case as well. And
Nice.
there can be other use cases, say like with ride sharing. I remember back in 2017 there was a ride sharing application being developed for like Arcade City. I'm not really sure where that went, so I'm not really sure if ride sharing would be a great P2P use case in the end if it's like practically able to be done. But I think that's another use case that I could see happen on chain. Basically, anything that has advantages in being P2P is something that should be explored when it comes to using blockchain technology, in my opinion.
Yeah, the permissionless, on one hand, to be able to interact, but then, with the DAO, people are starting to build communities small enough that you know the people. And if you vote a certain way or you do a certain way and you adjudicate a case a certain way, if you're asked to do that as an adjuster, there's a little bit more reputation cost even beyond the scores and the reputation system. You say, these people, you hang out in the Discord together. So there's some really nice primitive extending that DAO on that kind of social group circle thing with the permissionless and in the immediate execution. So it's such an exciting possibility.
Yeah, I think it's quite difficult to design a system where you're able to kind of internalize like reputation and social costs. But anyone who's able to like successfully crack that model, particularly in the format of a DAO, say with regards to P2P insurance, or it could be other things, could be solving like a huge problem. There could be $1 billion opportunity there. That's why I think the whole idea about soul tokens that Vitalik and a few others and a few others that have explored it, I think soul tokens are quite interesting. It's still like a concept that needs to be developed a bit more, but it is a way of them trying to internalize, reputation, right, and apply that in a meaningful way to smart contract or P2P based applications. And I think that's going to be very, very important in the future, and that's going to become more and more used in applications.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for giving us the insight. It's always nice to see people's perspective and not just the technology and the capability that's on, but what can be built, especially with our learnings over time. And we've learned a lot of people come to the space, get excited over the headline they hear in crypto or mainstream media, but builders who have been in, you've looked at the field, before you Fantom, you're already thinking about some idea. I've been thinking about software composability, and when I met Vitalik and Joe Lubin, they were talking about like smart contract composability. I was like, that lines up really well. But truly composable application on the UI side, so that where there's a bridge or a trade, it all looks the same and it allows you to Lego block. That's still early, the no-code type of Web3 tool, and that's what we're working on. So, but we rely on builders who are building underlying infrastructure. You mentioned fast, right? Secure, right? And safe, right? You gotta do that, and cheap. And I think for us, on top of that safety is also the joy of being able to say, hey, this computer program works for me. Right, I'm not at the mercy of some big brand and some big banks where I'm just like, please open an account for me. This is something you can participate in. And I think that giving them that power with the ease that comes with a mobile device is definitely our goal. And we are certainly very much aligned of seeing Web3 take its next step to be more relevant to day-to-day lives of people.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think that's the right angle that you're approaching it at. The more that the user interface becomes easier to use, the more users you're going to get. And that's basically the trend of technology over time.
For sure. And it happens in every single thing. Desktop computer got easier to use. Mobile, there was a whole era of mobile where you have to type with like 7 buttons, and nobody really knew how to do that. And then the keyboards get better, the screen got better, and we finally get adoption. I think we're maybe at the Nokia stage of blockchain. Maybe the BlackBerry is coming next and the iPhone is there. So we'll see where we are. But what I love about the whole story of mobile is that Qualcomm rules it all, right? Underneath that transformation from Nokia to BlackBerry with a keyboard, and iPhone is a Qualcomm chipset. So I think this idea that there's a shared infrastructure and that getting back over time, cellular being reliable, blockchain being fast, secure, and easy to use and cheap is a very important component. And thank you for the work you're doing in this community.
Yeah, and I think overall, like you see in technology over time, like for example, the internet, the applications or the platforms that have the best user experience are usually the ones that like win out in the end, right? Like why is Google so dominant in search engine, right?
Yes.
It's because the user interface is very simple. When you go to Google, you just see the logo and you see a search block, and then you see a button, right?
Yes.
And so all you have to do is type what you're searching for, press enter, and very, very quickly, bam, you get your results, right? That's why they're the dominant player. And I think it's going to be the same case with any technology that's consumer facing, such as like, blockchain technology. So any way that you make the user experience as easy as possible for the most like basic user out there, the more users you're going to get probably in the end, and the more network effects you're going to get.
Yeah, you have to hide the complexity. So if I want to buy an NFT that's on another chain, I have to bridge something. It'll be great. We say, you want to buy this? Buy, scanned, okay, done. And then underneath it is bridging and things and reservations and moving the funds and moving it back and putting a save and putting in a thing and creating a SOBAL token. That can all be automated because we have the technology for multi-core and for whatever to bridge it together and to automate stuff. So I definitely think that's where we're going. It needs to be one button. It needs to be one tap. It needs to be one Face ID. If we can achieve that, I think we have something to come to people with. Is hey, Web3 is really the web evolved, not just this other things you can and discuss just because the price go up but down a little bit. So we are builders and we care about the web, the internet, and the experience to people. And at the end of the day, if technology can improve people's life and allow them to connect in ways they couldn't, that's kind of our goal to make that opportunity happen.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think that's the direction. I think that's the direction we're going in.
Sounds good. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I hope the community enjoy this educational sessions about the Web3 community and the Fantom community and then the toolset as well. As always, we do these Web3 watch series with builders, people who are in the trenches making this happen, not just people observing on the outside and commenting on it. And it's really great to be able to have this level of discussion around all this topic. So thank you so much, Michael.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris, again. Yeah, thanks again for the opportunity.